There is no final victory for democracy, where the forces of authoritarianism are defeated forever. People who want a dictator will always reappear when political and economic chaos makes others lose faith in democracy. That is when they will try to sell you their fix for all of your nation's problems, as in, just give up your freedom and everything will be fine. For me, however, it's incredibly scary to imagine someone having such power, knowing they will use it to cause untold suffering to millions of people. And there have been plenty of times in America's past when that almost happened. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and happy Halloween. With Americans once again going to the polls to elect a president, I think it's time for me to once more discuss a few new scenarios where the United States became a dictatorship. Number 1. King Henry of America. Americans should always be suspicious of anyone who wants a king, which brings me to our first subject, Prince Henry of Prussia. In our timeline, he was the 13th child of King Frederick Wilhelm I of Prussia and Princess Sophia of Hanover. His older brother, known to history as Frederick the Great, would become King of Prussia, but Henry was no slouch himself. As a child of the Age of Enlightenment, Henry was a lover of literature, arts, and, much like his brother, men. He was also a talented military commander in his own right, winning many battles for his brother while avoiding the costly defeats Frederick is famous for. He also tried to become the king of other countries and was even offered the crown of the United States. Details are sketchy since we only had rumors to go on until Prince Henry's unsent rejection letter was discovered in his papers many years later, but in 1786, America was struggling through a financial crisis while the government was under the ineffective Articles of Confederation. Desperate for a way to save America, Henry was offered the crown of the United States from a faction of men that included then President of the Confederation Congress, Nathaniel Gorham, and also Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, the Prussian military officer who trained the Continental Army. Also, future First Secretary of the Treasury and a previous candidate of mine for American dictator, Alexander Hamilton, may also have been part of this faction. Presumably, they wanted a strong leader who could decree them out of their current crisis. Henry was likely seen as the ideal candidate due to America's friendliness to Prussia, then under the allegedly enlightened rule of Frederick the Great. Nevertheless, the scheme did not go anywhere, as it appears the offer was rescinded even before Prince Henry had a chance to decline. And to give Henry credit, in his unsent letter, he seemed to realize that it was a bad idea to force a king on America so soon after they kicked out the last one. In the end, Henry spent the rest of his life advising the kings of Prussia, and the United States eventually adopted the constitution it has today. But what if Henry became king? Assuming there isn't too much fuss about crowning Henry, the new king of America would address America's financial woes as the leader of a government likely similar to the government America had just kicked out. Now, to be honest, I don't think King Henry would be a bad leader. He seemed like an enlightened dude, and America would probably have an elected legislator that could be a check on the monarchy. But the bigger issue is what King Henry represents. Now, the YouTuber What Why How recently put out an excellent video describing the inherent flaws of monarchies, and I highly recommend you check it out. But in summary, monarchism is an inherently corrupt system that gives money and executive power to an individual solely because of the luck of their birth, with no option other than violence to remove them should they prove to be incompetent, corrupt, and/or insane. For America to adopt such a system, especially at such a formative time in its history, seems like a bad idea to me. I mean, in our timeline, Henry died without children, so even if he rules as an enlightened monarch, when he dies, he leaves America without a successor. So does America fall into civil war as different claimants vie for the throne? Or does America just ask for another Prussian princeling to take over? If so, there is no guarantee this new king would be as moderate as Henry. Also, what are the long-term consequences of America having closer ties with Prussia? Would America turn into a militaristic and aggressive state eventually led by its own version of Wilhelm II? Sorry everyone, but kings are bad, and Americans should reject anyone who tries to become one. Number 2. Acting President Joseph Lane. The Electoral College is, to put it mildly, terrible, and here's another reason why. In 1860, Americans were getting ready to elect a president while the country was increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. The mostly pro-slavery Democrats were unable to pick a candidate, and thus the different factions within the party fielded their own. Northern Democrats picked Stephen Douglas, Southern Democrats picked John C. Breckinridge, and a new third party, called the Constitutional Union Party, picked John Bell. However, Because the Democrats had split their vote, it seemed likely that the mostly anti-slavery Republicans and their candidate, Abraham Lincoln, would win the presidency. Unless the most unlikely bit of constitutional tomfoolery happened. According to Cy Shepard, an associate professor of political science at Long Island University, Brooklyn, the Democrats had a Hail Mary play to deny Lincoln the presidency. You see, the thing about American presidential elections is that voters aren't directly voting for the president, but rather a slate of electors who represent their state and are pledged to vote for a certain presidential candidate and their vice president when the Electoral College meets. Whichever candidate wins the most votes in the Electoral College wins the presidency. But in an effort to prevent Lincoln from winning, the Northern and Southern Democrats and the Constitutional Union Party decided to run a fusion slate of electors in certain northern states, including New York, which had a strong Democratic base. If this fusion slate won in New York, then Lincoln would not get enough votes to win a majority of the Electoral College, and, according to the Constitution, the House of Representatives would have to step in to decide who becomes president, which has happened before in American history. Now, in our timeline, Lincoln won New York and the enslavers rebelled not long afterwards. But what if Lincoln lost New York? Now, I've read an alternate history like this before, specifically Charles Rosenberg's 2020 novel, The Day Lincoln Lost, but Shepard's scenario has a unique twist. He argues that due to various factions that made up the House at the time, and the fact that each state delegation only gets one vote, it's unlikely any candidate could get a majority of votes. So, unless Douglas told his supporters in Congress to support Lincoln, the House would be unable to elect a president. So, does this mean America wouldn't have a president? Well, here's where things get both interesting and incredibly stupid. You see, the House only votes for the president if the Electoral College can't pick a winner. The vice president, however, is selected by the Senate, and unlike the House, the senators vote as individuals, not as a delegation. Shepard believes that given the political makeup of the Senate at the time, they would have chosen John C. Breckinridge's running mate and Oregon Senator Joseph Lane as vice president. And if the House remains deadlocked until the start of the next term, then Lane, whose campaign only received 18% of the vote, would, under the Constitution, become the acting president. Insanity! And it's going to get worse. Now, Breckinridge and Lane were running on a platform of guaranteeing the spread of slavery to the territories, and while Lane's state of Oregon was a free state, it had only become a state in 1859, and many of the people who had settled it were from slaveholding states. Thus, they were sympathetic to the enslavers, and would perhaps even support legalizing slavery in Oregon so slaves could be brought in to work in households and on farms. Even Lane himself once said, "Non-intervention on the subject of slavery, I may emphatically say, is the cardinal maxim of the democracy." Yikes. So, it's likely that acting President Lane couldn't do much. Having become president on a mere technicality, he would lack any kind of mandate and be unpopular in much of the country. So at best, his term simply delays the start of the Civil War, while he desperately searches for a solution or a distraction from the slavery issue. Shepard, however, proposes a nightmare scenario where the questionable way Lane was elected causes the free states to secede, as Shepard thinks they'd be fed up with a government that seems dominated by the slave states. And Lane might actually try to stop them. Now, in our timeline, Lane supported the secession of the southern states, saying once that the Union was not formed by force, nor can it be maintained by force. But since hypocrisy is quite common in politics, President Lane might move to defend the interests of pro-Union citizens in what I'm calling the Free States of America. And worse yet, the Free States might still lose. Advantages that the North had in our timeline, such as industry, manpower, better logistics, the U.S. Navy, international recognition, etc., might not exist or be undermined by people or state governments who feel the Union is more important than their distaste for slavery. And following their victory, President Lane and his successors would use this opportunity to ensure slavery is protected in the Constitution through a series of amendments which prevent the federal government from ever outlawing slavery and also deny African Americans the opportunity to ever become citizens. Any free Africans are deported en masse to Liberia, which becomes a protectorate of America. New states in the Western Territories enter the Union as slave states, while existing free states, like Oregon, soon legalize slavery, and thus America is no longer the land of the free, all because of a glitch in how America picks their president. So, I don't know, maybe we should fix this whole electoral college thing before someone else does something stupid with it. Number 3. Citizen Hearst. The American news media is a powerful institution, and if misused, it can cause people to lose faith in democracy. Which brings us to our next subject, William Randolph Hearst, the wealthy media mogul who owns so many newspapers and magazines in America that around the turn of the 20th century, 1 out of 5 Americans were reading from a Hearst publication. His success came in part due to his policy of printing any story to sell papers, no matter how many scandals or lies it contained. If it got people to spend their money, it was good enough for Hearst. Perhaps most famously, Hearst papers were known for drumming up support for a war to liberate Cuba, which ultimately did happen when the Spanish-American War of 1898 broke out. Now, it's debatable how much blame Hearst should get for starting this war, but nevertheless, he became the historic face of the sensationalist practice of yellow journalism, and also was the inspiration for Charles Foster Kane of the 1941 Orson Welles movie Citizen Kane. Funny enough, not only was Kane briefly president in Eugene Byrne and Kim Newman's 1997 collection back in the USSA, but Hearst also ran for president himself. In 1904, he ran for president as a Democrat, despite having little experience with politics. Nevertheless, he had a populist appeal, and of course, owned newspapers that sang his praises. However, his progressive stances on things like women's suffrage and labor rights cost him the nomination. Now, this didn't stop him from running for public office again, but he never got anywhere higher than a brief stint in Congress. This was partly because of his unwillingness to listen to any advice from political professionals, which included actually campaigning in person and not just letting his newspapers do all the talking. By the 1930s, however, Hearst's politics began to change. Possibly his enormous wealth made him more conservative because he shed his progressive idealism and started to oppose organized labor, became a critic of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and supported the American First isolationist movement. He was also very anti-Japanese and believed they were working with Mexico to invade America. Furthermore, he was very anti-communist and employed many journalists who stoked fear of a red menace in the minds of Americans. One such writer even organized a band of vigilantes to break up a strike in San Francisco. This stance made Hearst very sympathetic to the anti-communist Nazi Party in Germany, and he published many glowing stories about Hitler's regime. Now, to be fair, Hearst didn't approve of Hitler's anti-Semitism, as Hearst had many friends and business partners who were Jewish, but Hearst seemed to think Hitler could be talked down from his hatred of Jews. Well, I, for one, am very glad that today's media treats fascists much more seriously. Hearst may also have lost faith in democracy and the rule of law around this time. In 1933, Hearst produced and helped write a film called Gabriel Over the White House. In it, a fictional president survives a near-death experience and then, either inspired by or possessed by the angel Gabriel and the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, seizes control of America in order to save it. He dismisses Congress and his cabinet, declares martial law, uses the military to go after criminals, and threatens war in other nations. Talkernet History released a video about it if you want to learn more, but it's not a huge leap to think that Hearst would act like this president if given the chance. Fortunately for us, that didn't happen. World War II ended with Hitler's downfall, but Hearst continued his media campaign against communism before dying in 1951. But his cabal of anti-communist writers lived on, and they helped inspire Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, who became famous for his communist witch hunts in the 1950s. But what if Hearst was elected president in 1936? Let's assume Hearst, perhaps inspired by his own film, tries again to become president, but this time listens to people who actually know how to run a presidential campaign. Thanks to them and his media empire, Hearst managed to unite all the various anti-FDR factions to get himself elected president. President Hearst, truly believing he was chosen by God to save America, uses his newspapers to drum up support for the dismantling of democracy. Taking a page from his buddy Hitler, he organizes his own brown shirts to break up strikes and harass enemies of his regime, including anyone suspected of communist sympathies. Any journalists who speak out against him are jailed, and newspapers critical of him suddenly find themselves absorbed into Hearst's media empire. Freedom of the press quickly becomes a quaint memory. With his iron grip on the press, President Hearst whips up war fever in America in order to justify his invasion of Mexico and other parts of Latin America. All done, of course, to prevent Japanese imperialism. And as an aging President Hearst becomes more frail during his fourth term, perhaps a rising star in his administration from Wisconsin might seize the reins of power when the old man finally passes on. Democracy dies in darkness indeed. Number 4. President General Douglas MacArthur. Americans like electing generals, but our next subject is someone we should be happy never got to the White House. General Douglas MacArthur was a talented military commander who became a general while fighting on the Western Front in World War I. In 1932, he commanded the troops that broke up a large group of World War I vets in D.C., known as the Bonus Army, who were demanding the cash payments promised to them by the U.S. government. With the help of cavalry and tanks, MacArthur drove the protesters out of D.C., killing 2 and injuring dozens of others. During World War II, MacArthur was in the Philippines, an American colony at the time, when the Japanese attacked. After being forced to retreat to Australia, MacArthur was one of the senior commanders in the Pacific Theater who saw to Japan's eventual defeat. And after the end of World War II, MacArthur became the dictator of Japan. Okay, perhaps that's a bit unfair. Specifically, he was in charge of the American occupation of Japan, and he did help transition them into a liberal democracy. That said, to do this did require him to occasionally rule by decree and work alongside many former leaders of the defeated Imperial Japanese government. Additionally, as YouTuber Indy Nidell pointed out in his video on the occupation of Japan, this was a role that MacArthur kind of enjoyed. Interesting side note, Jack Nimmersheim's short story, The Rising Sun at Dusk, had MacArthur become the actual dictator of Japan, and it inspired the cover of the 1997 anthology Alternate Tyrants. Indeed, it was actually quite common for our timeline's MacArthur to relax in a kimono. Anywho, another thing to remember about MacArthur is that he put a lot of work into his image. As historian and author Hampton Side said in 2019 while writing for Time magazine, MacArthur loved the trappings of power and stayed eternally vigilant to the micro nuances of publicity. And because of this relentless self-promotion, MacArthur was able to command a large fan base in America, especially among the right-wing crowd, which included former leaders in the American First Committee. These fans tried to organize a presidential campaign for the general in 1948, and even had the support of some Hearst papers, but nothing really came of it. Moving on. When the Korean War broke out, American President Harry Truman picked General MacArthur to lead America and its allies in preventing the fall of South Korea. MacArthur was initially successful, especially after pulling off the risky landings on the occupied port of Incheon, well behind North Korean lines. The North Koreans retreated, but rather than negotiate a ceasefire, General MacArthur invaded North Korea proper, ignoring warnings that doing so would cause China to enter the war. Ultimately, that is what China did, and it sent MacArthur's armies retreating back behind the 38th parallel. With a quick victory in Korea out of the question, MacArthur allegedly proposed using nuclear weapons on North Korea's border with China to prevent further Chinese reinforcements and supplies from entering the peninsula. How serious MacArthur was is still debated by historians, but had this happened, it would have surely led to a response from the Soviet Union, and thus probably kicked off World War III. Thankfully, following many public disagreements with Truman, MacArthur was relieved of his command. The still popular, yet angry, MacArthur seemed primed for another run the presidency in 1952, with the previously mentioned Joseph McCarthy being one of his backers. But support for MacArthur fizzled as he gave speeches where he seemed more interested in settling old scores than in governing the country. Afterwards, his deteriorating health meant MacArthur didn't do much until his death in 1964. But he is still remembered today for his larger-than-life personality, as well as his skill as a military commander. But imagine if MacArthur ran for and won the presidency in 1952. Let's assume MacArthur never gets approval to do the Incheon landings. Disgusted, he resigns from his command and begins actively campaigning to be the Republican nominee for president. Meanwhile, a UN counteroffensive along the Pusan perimeter does manage to break through the North Korean lines, sending them retreating north. The retreat, however, is relatively orderly, and thus gives the appearance of a slow, costly advance. Hopes for a ceasefire are also dashed when Chinese troops enter North Korea to defend it from any invasion. With public support for the Korean War dropping, MacArthur's claims that he could have won the war quickly if he wasn't stopped by the cowards in Washington gets a lot of sympathetic ears. The Republicans nominate him as their candidate over Dwight Eisenhower and others, and he is eventually elected president. Once in office, President General MacArthur approves the use of nuclear weapons in Korea, turning the limited conflict into World War III when the Soviet Union intervenes. This does not exactly lead to nuclear annihilation, as there were few nukes available and delivery methods, such as by bombers, were relatively short-ranged. However, at this point, the US would still have the edge in both, so while the death toll would be enormous, especially in the Soviet Union, Europe, and East Asia, America and its allies might actually win this one. However, with the global economy in tatters and some American coastal cities being destroyed by Soviet bombers, such as how Harry Turtledove described in his The Hot War trilogy, we could see President General MacArthur pushing through legislation limiting civil rights and giving more power to the presidency in order to get America through the crisis. This seizure of power, however, lasts years after the war ends, as MacArthur finds ruling by decree, much like he did in Japan, is preferable to dealing with Congress or elections. In my humble opinion, MacArthur is a good example of why some old soldiers should just be allowed to fade away rather than get involved in politics. Number 5. President North. Speaking of old soldiers who really need to get out of politics, let's talk about Ollie North. North is a veteran of the Vietnam War who rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps. More importantly for this video, he was a National Security Council staff member during the Iran-Contra affair. In a scheme that violated U.S. law, officials within President Ronald Reagan's administration sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds of those sales to fund right-wing Contra rebels fighting against the leftist government of Nicaragua. North took the lion's share of the blame for Iran-Contra, but his convictions were later reversed. However, North's televised testimony in front of Congress made him a celebrity among the American right. North, or more likely his Republican handlers, were able to spin him as an old-fashioned American hero who the dirty libs were attacking for doing anything necessary to defeat the Red Menace. North found his mailbox full of messages of support, while pro-North public demonstrations popped up across the country. Soon there was talk of North being president, with fans making bumper stickers and t-shirts for his hypothetical campaign. Although how much of this support was genuine is debatable. Much of the support North received, along with the threats made to the Democrats who were investigating him, were carried out by conservative organizations who organized mass mailing campaigns or staged the alleged spontaneous demonstrations. In 1994, North ran for Senator of Virginia. Millions of dollars poured into his campaign from across the country, and in his speeches, he attacked the news media in a way that predicted the fake news claims of later elections. Ultimately, he was just barely defeated by Democrat Chuck Robb. Moderate Republicans came out against North, and it didn't help that a slim majority of voters still thought what North and other Reagan staffers did during the Iran-Contra affair was wrong. Although denied public office, North remained in the public eye with a radio show, frequent appearances on Fox News, publishing several books, and even being the president of the National Rifle Association for less than a year. He even endorsed boot camps for allegedly troubled teens that kidnapped children and took them out in the wilderness where some were molested or killed. So yeah, not the best of dudes. However, I should note there are a surprising number of alternate histories featuring a President North. In the TV show Sliders, there were at least 2 timelines where North was president, and both involved the Cold War continuing late into the 1990s. And in at least one of those timelines, the Earth was destroyed. North is also the president of the US in Dark Future, a miniature war game universe with a novel tie-in series, with many entries written by the previously mentioned Kim Newman. In that timeline, North screws up the American economy so much that outside of a few cities, most of the country is a barren wasteland controlled by violent gangs. I'm sensing a theme here in President North alternate histories. So let me add my own President North timeline. Let's assume North was elected Senator of Virginia in 1994, and his star continued to rise. North goes on to be chosen as Republican candidate for president in 2000. He wins, but then he has to deal with 9/11. President North likely invades Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's his version of the Patriot Act where things really start to diverge. In our timeline, this controversial law expanded the power of America's security services in order to combat terrorism, but it also severely infringed on civil liberties. But in this alternate timeline, North's Patriot Act goes even further. Taking the advice of the far-right members in his government, this alternate Patriot Act becomes more like an enabling act, which gives North and his administration dictatorial powers. North's propagandists make use of the same tactics they used during the Iran-Contra affair to make it appear there is mass support for this law. Letters and phone calls pour into media outlets, while supposedly spontaneous demonstrations break out in the streets, all asking for President North to save America from Islamic terrorism, which for some reason involves the arrests of Democratic politicians, the bloody suppression of any anti-North protests, and rounding up Muslim Americans into concentration camps. Additionally, North's authoritarian presidency would just as likely be corrupt as it is oppressive. With little to no checks on its power, officials inside the North regime would plunder America to their heart's content. Laws would be flaunted just like North did back in the 1980s. I mean, I might get some flack for saying this, but as bad as W was, it could have been so much worse if someone with even less respect for the rule of law was president during 9/11. In summary, democracy in my country has not always been secure. The American experiment has almost failed numerous times, such as during its very inception, in the lead up to the Civil War, the rise of fascism in the 1930s, and several times during the Cold War, where it seemed the fear of communism had driven everyone mad. Sometimes I feel we are living in one of those times again, but it's my sincere hope the American people won't lose their faith in democracy. Because regardless of what disagreements we might have on policy, we should all be horrified by someone with no respect for democracy. For such a person to come to power in America is truly the stuff of nightmares. Well, that's all I have to say in this subject. If you enjoy what I do, please like, comment, subscribe, click that bell icon, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Happy Halloween.